Okay.
So read up what anybody says. Reading it out loud.
All right, this is a test. This is a test for our streamers. If you could, in the chat, let us know how the sound is doing. We want to make sure that you have a great experience as well. So please don't be shy, because this helps us make sure you can hear everything.
If it would just pop up, nothing has yet.
So please put in the chat so we know if the sound is working. How do you feel?
Carla says sound is fine.
Sound is fine, could be better. Like fine, or it's fine. I don't know what kind of fine that is. Can you put some emojis with that? Okay. All right, just want to check this out.
Paul says can see and hear you.
You can see it. Oh, that's glorious. That is glorious. Okay, beautiful. Then that means we will get started. So thank you for our wonderful volunteer, Jeff. Thank you. Round of applause for Jeff. And just so you know, if you are joining us on the streaming, this is new, because I usually turn the laptop around and use the built-in laptop camera. But we're testing out, and we're doing a new camera this time, so the keyboard could actually be towards me once I'm done. And we're hoping this will be a better experience for you who are streaming. So also, when you are enjoying these stories or moments, feel free to have your comments or emojis. That always makes a fun time, and that way you feel like you're together with the audience there too. So, all right, just so everyone knows, we will have people who come in late, but that's okay. We will guide them very carefully, even though we will just jump in, because it's time. We're just going to do it. And we are very excited, because this is the 90th house concert for Story Crossroads. Which is really exciting. Can you imagine? Well, eventually we'll get to 100, but we are excited about 90. And we also have so many funders that we're excited about that makes it possible for us to do things year-round. So year-round, we've gotten continuous funding from Utah Humanities, from the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, from the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, for well, it used to be called WestStaff, but now they're Creative West, so they're a regional art organization, so just so you have that name in mind. We also really appreciate the Zoo Arts and Parks of Salt Lake County, also known as ZAP. And yes, every 10 years we get that on the ballot, and everyone said, yes, we love it. So yay, everybody, thank you, because that is a huge difference for us too. The Salt Lake City Arts Council, and the City of Murray, I mean, there's a lot. And then people like you. So if you notice, there is, for those who are streaming, the storycrossroads.org/donate, and that's where you can, well, donate. There's even a QR code to make it super easy. And of course, we're here because we get to listen to Elizabeth Gibson. Now, she has been in the theater world. She has been in the voiceover world, and she, of course, is in the storytelling world. And we are excited. She used to be more up in Ogden, and now we got her in the Salt Lake Valley. I mean, how lucky are we? So let us bring to the stage, and maybe while we're applauding too, just double check your devices so they don't go off, because then the streamers will be like, oh, who had their phone on, right? Right, streamers? You'll say something in the chat if you hear any rings. Okay, great. I'm sure I got commitment from the streamers. And that way, we'll have a really wonderful experience, and Elizabeth will explain more about what is right here behind me. So without further ado, let us bring up Elizabeth Gibson!
All right, good evening. I'm going to raise this up just a little bit. All right, let's, hold on just a moment. I always have to remind myself, lefty, loosey, righty, tighty, and then I get it right. Okay. Whoops. It doesn't like me. There we go. All right. So, Colonel Winfield Scott Gibson III began life As a barefoot Mississippi boy growing up pretty hard scrabble during the Depression, he was, his father, Emmett, by most accounts was a pretty hard man, prone to violence, and also heavy drinking in order to kind of tap down on his inner demons. His mother, Martha, on the other hand, was a very sweet, affectionate person, probably deserving of a happier union. But life was what it was. And so they kind of struggled along together. They had 3 children. That would be Scott, Bill, and little Martha, before the marriage ended in divorce, which was a very scandalous choice back in those days. One of Scott's saddest memories, most difficult memories, was as an 8-year-old boy standing on the Greenville, Mississippi courthouse steps, being coached by his father and his father's attorney on how to answer the judge if he asked about his mother. So he knew some of the stories weren't correct, but he wanted to please his father, so he memorized everything, and at the right time, during the court proceedings, he got up and he regurgitated everything back. The consequences of that is that Martha lost custody of the children. So she packed up and went back to Nashville, Tennessee, to live with her parents. And Emmett, who was not at all emotionally or financially prepared to be the only parent, had custody of 3 small children. Now the responsibility fell on his parents a little bit, but they were very elderly and poor as well. So, Emmett became a sheriff for the county, and he got a minimal salary, and he worked hard until, in the line of duty, he was shot and disabled. And then the county, thinking that they would just kind of tighten their belt a little bit, removed the salary from Emmett, and so they now had no money coming in and no parent who could make a living. And that is when Scott, as a very young boy, started getting up really early in the morning and running around to the porches of the neighbors and stealing milk bottles and going into the gardens and taking vegetables and fruit from the trees and bringing them back so that his little siblings would have something to eat. Now, all these experiences, rather than making him hard and angry like his father was, instead galvanized Scott to think that if there was a way, he would find it. If he worked hard enough, he could earn it. And if he learned how to do something, he would become so excellent at it that he would be able to rise above his circumstances and take care of his family. So he learned how to run trout lines on the Mississippi River with his dad. Very dangerous thing, because if the trout takes off with the line fast and your fingers are in the way, you could lose your fingers, especially a child. And he learned at a very young age, too young for us these days, to handle safely a .22 rifle so he could go out hunting for small game. And then with his friends, he would also go out a-frogging at night. And that's the first story that I'd like to tell you about, going a-frogging. Now, hunting frogs, if you're from the West, doesn't sound like a thing, because we grow our frogs pretty small right here. But along the Mississippi Delta, its byways, waterways, and bayous, bullfrogs can grow as tall as 2 feet long and weigh as much as 3 or 4 pounds. So bagging a frog could be like bagging a chicken and taking it home for free. So this is how they would do it. First of all, he would get together with 3 of the best friends of his life, boys he trusted, boys whose situation in life was much like his own, and then they would kind of pool their resources. You needed 4 boys to do this effectively. The first one would carry all the canvas bags to put the frogs in. The second one would carry the headlamp, which was like a miner's lamp, very intense. So if you shone it on a frog, the frog would freeze and be blinded. The third boy carried a long gig, which was a long ashwood, lightwood pole. You could easily maneuver it on the end of which was bolted 4 to 6 metal prongs that were, filed down to like razor thinness sharpness. And that was what you used to spear the frog, or at least to stop it in its tracks. Now the fourth boy would carry the .22. Now that was Scott's job. He was the one with his own rifle. And the .22 was in case the frog was too far away to get it, and also it was for protection. Now, there were two main predators for the bullfrog. The first one was obviously humans. The second one was the water moccasin. The water moccasin was a poisonous, venomous serpent that along these areas grew as much as 4 feet in length and could be as thick around the middle as 10 to 12 inches. It had kind of a flattish head, and when it opened its mouth and revealed its sharp fangs, its mouth and its throat were white like cotton, contrasted against its dark, exterior. But if you ever got close enough to see that, you were in a heap of trouble. But they did like to call those snakes also cottonmouths, obviously. So anyway, this is how the boys did it. So when they got to the waterways, the boy with the headlight would shine the light. They'd find a frog. They'd turn the headlight onto the frog. The frog would be blinded. The boy with the gig would get up, and if it was close enough, he would stab it. The boy with the bag would put it in the bag, and there you had your first frog. That's how they did it. So on this one night that I'm telling you about, the boys at this point were in their early teens. They met up on the railroad tracks in the south part of Greenville, Mississippi, really late at night. And they would come with all their supplies, and they would walk down the railroad tracks for a mile, find a footpath that went off to the left, and they would take that 2 miles to a thickly infested by snakes and bullfrogs cypress swamp. And there they would hunker low in the grass near the water and wait for the mating call of the bullfrog. And before long, they would start to hear, "Harumph, harumph." The boy with the headlamp stood up, turned on the light, and there he saw the head of a bullfrog protruding from the water. And then he ducked down and he began to go towards the frog. And the boy with the gig followed close behind. But then all of a sudden, that bullfrog sunk beneath the water. So they stopped and they waited and turned off the light. And then, harumph, harumph, the boy with the headlamp turned back on the light. The boy with the gig, they stood up, and darn, that frog had turned partially away so he could only be blinded in one eye. They turned off the headlamp. They conferred a bit and decided the guy with the headlamp would take the gig, go cross the shallow waterway, and get on the other side of the frog. So that's what he did. And once over there, he waited. Harumph, harumph, on with the headlight. The frog was blinded. He took the gig. He drove it into the frog. Scott came running with the bag, and they bagged their first prize. And that's how they did it the entire night, until at the end, when they saw a sandbar. They called it an island, but it was a sandbar in the shallow water area. And on top of it were all these bullfrogs, especially one who was sitting above the water, completely exposed. He had to be a 4-pounder. That's the one they wanted. It was too far away for the gig, so this is what they did. They waited, they turned on the headlamp, blinded the frog. Scott rose with the .22. He took aim, and kapow! The frog flew backwards and lay on his back, flipping and flopping. Well, just as they were about to cross the waterway and go bag that frog, the boy with the headlamp saw something over in his peripheral vision. It was a water moccasin coming along the water, heading for the same thing that they were. Its head was above the water, its mouth was open, its fangs were protruding, and its jaw was dislocated so that it could hold on to this big bullfrog. So Scott raised up, he aimed at the snake, but when he let go of the bullet, it skimmed across the snake's body. And then the snake stopped, turned his head towards the boy with the headlamp, and headed towards the boys at the riverbank. Scott stepped up again, aimed, fired, and the head of the snake flew back right as it was about to make the riverbank. And then the boys stood back because that thing was roiling and roiling and rolling and flopping and freaking out. And it was just as dangerous, dead, as it was alive because its fangs had been out and it was full of poison. So they stood back, waited for it to come to a rest on the riverbank. And then the boy with the gig reached down and with the barbs lifted up the snake, flicked it far into the forest for the animals to eat, and they breathed a sigh of relief. Oh. And then before anything else could happen, they grabbed the canvas bags, they crossed the water over to the sandbar, they bagged that kicking dead frog, and they went on with all their frogs, very carefully stepping through the wet areas, snake-infested swamp, got out to the field where there was a long log, and they stopped and they unloaded all of their prize, and they began to clean and gut the frogs, fascinated, because even when they cut open the frogs and gutted them, they were still flopping and freaking out. And it was pretty sight to be seen. They put them back in the bags, and with those flopping bags, they threw them over their shoulders. They headed down the path to the railroad tracks, from the railroad tracks to town, and then they shook hands like men when they got to town. Good job, good job. And they went off to their homes. That particular night, Scott watched his friends walk away. They had grown up together. They worked together in hunting expeditions like a well-oiled machine. And he believed they were the most wonderful young men he knew. And so he felt like they would be friends forever. Little did he know that life events were going to take him far away very soon, and he would never see them again. But on this, what would be their last night of frogging together, he wasn't thinking about any of that. So he turned towards home. When he got home, he took his bag of frogs, threw them on the kitchen table, and then he went to bed, fell into bed, fully dressed, and finally around 2 or 3 in the morning went off to sleep. A couple of hours later, he was awakened to the most awful shrieking, "Lord Jesus, the devil's among us! The devil's among us! Save us! Get him off of me!" And he jumped out of bed. He met his father. They both run out of their respective rooms at the same time and met up in the kitchen. And there in the doorway, silhouetted there, was their friend and hired help. She had her straw hat on the ground, her pocketbook on the ground, and she had her hands heavenward. "Lord Jesus, save us, the devil's among us." So here's the deal. This was the sight. Those 3 frogs that were dead had escaped the sack. And they were leaping and frogging, their heads, leaping and rolling, their heads askew, their bellies open, covered with frog blood, all over the kitchen floor. Now, in those parts, there was a superstition that a dancing frog on the Sabbath day meant the devil was afoot. And it was Sunday, and there wasn't just one frog, there were 3. And so this poor woman put on her straw hat and she got her purse and she went harumphing out of the house. She never set foot in such an awful place again. They gathered up the frogs in Scott, but it was too late to save for their friend. But they did manage to get the frogs up. So it ended with kind of a sad note, but years later, when Scott would sometimes visit the home place, and he would drive down those swampy roads where he once, as a young man, went frogging and hunting, the memories would come pouring back to such an extent he would have to pull over to the side of the road, and he would think, "Oh, good gravy. If only just one more time I could go a frogging. So, but very shortly the whole thing changed. Emmett had remarried a much younger woman, and she was on her third child now that Emmett was in his teens. Emmett had a hard time feeding 3. He was having an even harder time feeding 6 children. So finally he relented and allowed the children to go to their mother in Nashville, Tennessee. So they went. The last one to go on the train, because he had to save up the very little money that they had and send them, was Scott. And it was in the wintertime. So they put him on the train for a several days' ride without money or food or proper clothing, because that's what they had. He went on the train ill. And as the days progressed, some people on the train felt sorry for him and shared some of their food. But in a weakened condition, he became sicker and sicker. And by the time he got to Nashville, there was actually a screw-up. People weren't expecting him at that time in the station. So he began the 5-mile walk from the train station to the home downtown on Neely Road, where his grandmother lived. Somebody saw him stumbling along the road, ill, and picked him up and drove him the rest of the way. By the time he got to his grandmother's house, he was semi-conscious. They got him into bed, called a doctor, and as the doctor was examining him, Scott had an experience that he said became the defining experience of his life, and it would influence him forever. As the doctor was looking down at Scott, suddenly, Scott was at the ceiling, and he was looking down at himself in bed with the doctor looking at him, and then turning to the grandmother and the mother, and in very hushed tones saying that likely Scotty had double pneumonia, and that in his weakened, emaciated state, he would not survive the night. And then Scott, from his bird's eye view, saw something remarkable. When the doctor walked out of the room, he saw them kneel by his bed and begin to pray for his life, that God would spare him. And in a little short while, Scott opened his eyes and he was back down in the bed again. Very shortly after that, his fever broke, and over the next few days, all his symptoms began to recede, and he began to return to his normal. Later on, he would write that the good Lord had decreed that he would not die, but that he would live to fulfill his obligations. And obligations down the road he would have. Shortly after this, Martha, his mother, fell in love with someone and followed him to Michigan. So did Scott. So Scott finished high school in Michigan and then began college. And then at the age of 19, his first year of college, something enormous happened. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And suddenly, all the campuses across the country were bereft of their young men and some of their young women. They just emptied out as everyone prepared to be drafted or went up and enlisted. Scott, in his very weakened state, knew he was in no position to try to get the military to take him. So when his mother fell in love with someone else and went up to California, where the vegetables and fruit were growing plentifully and it was inexpensive, she sent for Scott, and Scott followed. There he worked for 9 months, trying to eat and strengthen again, and he tried for the Navy. The Navy turned him down. 3 months later, he tried the Army Air Corps, and they accepted him. On December 30th, 1942, he became a member of the Army Air Corps, and they immediately shipped him to boot camp in Santa Ana. He went through boot camp quite well, and then he had to wait to take the aviation exam to see where best he could serve his country in the Army Air Corps. When he finally took it, he went to the very top for navigator, and just under that, pilot. And he wanted more than anything else to be a P-51 fighter pilot. That's what he wanted to do. But the military had other needs. So at that time, there were huge bombing raids being run across Europe against the Germans. And the chief planes for this were the B-17 and the B-24s. The B-17, known as the Flying Fortress, was an enormous plane. And it had 11 to 13 machine guns on it, depending on the one that you got. It had machine guns at the nose, at the cheeks, just above the pilot in a turret, down behind the wings onto the belly as a ball turret. There were 2 in the waist, 2 in the back by the tail, and then there was the tail rudder gunner. So it was highly fortified. Anywhere an enemy would try to attack it, there was a gunner there to try to get it. The problem was that Germany was well fortified, and they had enormous anti-aircraft guns on the ground, and their ace pilots, the Messerschmitts that would come from seemingly out of nowhere and pick off Allied planes. So the B-17 pilots were being killed, I think it was just at an enormous rate. So they needed to feed more airmen into the B-17 program, so that's how he was used. They put him into pilot school in Stockton. Now, lest you think that as he went to pilot school, he was safe until he went to Europe, you're wrong. The statistics for people who were training to be airmen was pretty bad. Through the 4 years that they trained them for the war, they lost about 13,000 in training, all the airmen. Scott got through it quite well. And he found finally, and he had high marks, he was highly skilled. Finally, he graduated the pilot program in Stockton on December 5th, 1943. Immediately, it was time for him to get his plane and his crew, so they put him on a train to Salt Lake City. And there in Salt Lake City, he was given his co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and his gunners. And they were given their plane. For months, several months, they worked together to become kind of the well-oiled machine that Scott was used to in his youth, being young, working in hunting parties with his friends. And once they got to that level, they were shipped to the East Coast, where they were fitted with this enormous gas tank that could go 3,000 miles for big bombing raids, and then to North Africa, Tunisia, and then they were there in Italy, where they would run the bombing raids over into Germany and Poland, etc. So what I'm going to tell you about is two of the battles that he was in. The first one was in August of 1944, so it was after D-Day. It was at the peak of the war. And they were to hit the oil fields in Plzeň, Romania. And so anyway, he was kind of inexperienced. He'd only been in 5 or 6 bombing raids. So in each of these, there would be B-24s, B-17s, and there would be 300 to 400 of them. And each plane had about 10 people, 10 crew. At the end of each bombing raid, they had lost about 10%. So these are just the numbers. We're talking about how dangerous it was. So anyway, on this one bombing raid, they had been briefed ahead of time that they were going to hit heavy flak, meaning that the anti-aircraft guns were going to be blasting away. They expected to run into 500 of them that were mounted on flatbed railroad cars around this oil refinery that they were supposed to hit. Sure enough, when they got there, the flak was so intense that Scott later wrote that the sky was full of nothing but black puffs of smoke and bright bursts of fire as each plane was hit. So, as he entered this, so many planes were going down that immediately, although he did not lose courage to continue on with what he was doing, he knew that death was imminent. And then he said he had another experience that was seminal for him. As he was heading towards the fighting, he said that suddenly, in the cockpit, he felt an entity, a person of peace and love, and peace completely filled the cockpit. He was no longer afraid, And then it's like a message went into his mind, and it was, you are not going to die today. God is with you. Be thankful and be happy. And with that, he was given such incredible confidence that he was able to move ahead, drop his bomb on the spot, and peel off. And he was one of the aircrafts that was not injured. Later on, though, in October of that year, he was doing a bombing raid over actually Germany. And this one was one for the record books. In this one, he was such a fine pilot at this point that as they flew in formation like this with the senior officer at the very lead, they put him just behind the lead officer, even though he was way lower in rank. The second in command was on his right, and there was another person on his left as a left wingman, and then 300 to 400 planes behind them. As they began to get to the target, they were taking such heavy fire that they took out the colonel in the front, they took out his left, the person on his left, and then the person on the right was the commanding officer now. He was supposed to move up into the lead position to set the timing of dropping the bombs, but there wasn't time for him to get there before hitting the target. So immediately, Scott just said over the radio, I'm taking the lead, and on he went. And he went forward and he looked for the target. He dropped the bomb, and while he was doing it, he took heavy anti-aircraft fire. The plane was becoming extremely damaged. He peeled off and began, because as soon as you drop the bomb, you go this way home, right? They all did, but he was so badly damaged he could not keep the elevation and he could not keep the speed of the other planes. So he fell back, and he went with all the other injured aircraft to the back of this armada that was going back towards Italy. And that's when it happened. All the Messerschmitts came up, the fighter pilots, and they came to the back of this armada, hoping to hit all the low-hanging fruit. And they began to pick off the American planes one by one. Suddenly, Scott looked up, and he had 5 planes. One here, one Messerschmitt here, one to his right, and 2 on his left. And they fired away. But he later claimed that he had some of the best gunners at this period of time in the war that was in the Army Air Corps. And they fought and fought and fought. And one by one, they picked off 1, 2, 3, 4. They downed 4 Messerschmitts. The 5th one, Scott said, peeled away and looked for a little bit easier low-hanging fruit. And finally, they got away, and they felt like they were taped together as an aircraft as they headed into northern Italy. Now, when they began to see the airfield coming up, they were relieved, but they knew they weren't out of trouble because the aircraft was so badly damaged. So he lined up with what was going to be the airfield and where the landing strip was going to be. And then he prepared to land. He was having a hard time stabilizing the aircraft because the back propeller had been shaved off in the firing. So what ended up happening is he was kind of trying to stabilize the aircraft, and then he tried to lower the wheels, and only one went down. The hydraulic system was damaged. Now the danger with this in a B-17 bomber is if you try to land on one wheel, the wing on the side without a wheel would dip down, catch the ground, send the plane into a cartwheel, and it would burst into flames. And that's not where he wanted to go. But suddenly, he said that the idea came to his mind, and this is what he did. As they lowered elevation, he pushed up on the engine on the right that had no wheel, and it lifted the wing at the same time that he reduced the engine on the left-hand side. That righted and stabilized the aircraft. And then as they tried to land, he went down gently on the one wheel, and as they were starting to get to the end of the runway, he just very gently tapped the wing on the ground enough to create the resistance with the flaps down. And that touch swung the plane around in an upright position, then in a circle, out into the mud, past the airfield, and stopped the plane in an upright position, missing the woods that were just beyond that. Well, when they opened the plane door, the men stumbled out into the mud. Scott said that he fell out into the mud on his knees and began vomiting up the contents of his stomach. He was so stressed. And as he was throwing up, he heard the engine of a Jeep coming up to the airfield. And he looked up, and when the Jeep stopped, a highly decorated British officer leapt off the Jeep, came walking through the mud up to Scott. Scott tried to stand at some form of attention, and the British officer said, "Hell of a landing, Scott. Hell of a landing. Yank, hell of a landing." And he made it. And with that, he earned the Silver Star. So, there were many battles. He made it through the required 25 that only 26% were able to do. They actually went to 31, and then they were decommissioned from that part and went back to the United States. As you know, in May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. They were preparing for a ground invasion of Japan, and then that ended with the dropping of the atomic bombs. So now Scott had the choice to be a free man, and he decided he would like to try his hand at being a civilian and maybe going into sales and making a little bit more money than what the military had given him. So he got out of the military in 1946. He was hired by Dow Chemical, and he started selling to military bases. The only important thing to know about this short period of time when he was out of the military is that he went to Point Hueneme to sell to an officer over the base there. And as he was there, he happened to walk through a room that contained the group of secretaries who were the clerical support for the entire base. And there he spied the most beautiful girl with black hair, this beautiful eyes, a lovely figure, lovely dress. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. So instead of talking about sales when he met with the officer, instead he said, "I have seen the most beautiful girl, and I would like for you to please make an introduction for me." And so the officer went to this young woman, and he said, "This former flying ace from World War II would like to make your acquaintance. He's very handsome and he's very respectable." She said, "Sure." And so he made the introduction, and kapow, they were married 6 months later. Her name was Jessica Hazel Smith. She was from North Central North Carolina, from off of a tobacco farm, and just happened to be in California hoping for a better life, and boy, did she get one. They married. They hitchhiked on their honeymoon up the coast of California, and it was then that he decided he was done with the civilian life, and he wanted to go back into the military because he missed the structure and the purpose and the mission. And she agreed. Go in. He did. They punished him. They bumped him down a rank because he had gotten out, but he didn't care at that time because he was so happy to be back. So, immediately they sent him to be part of the occupying forces in Japan. Jessma went home to the tobacco farm, but when Scott found out that they were putting her to work in the fields, he was so angry at that point that he talked to his commanding officer, and he got her sent to Japan, and they were given a little married quarters to live in. It was there they had their first child, Mark, and then the Korean War broke out. So, Scott lived on Honshu Air Force Base in Nagoya, but he would fly and do missions in Korea. He would fly to Seoul, and then he would be sent to enemy-occupied territory where they would fly into kind of an obscure airstrip, and they would do reconnaissance on the ground, looking to see troop movements, almost like a forward observer. There would be a patrol of like 20 men. At the same time, there would always be aerial patrols going on at the same time because they could see from a different perspective. This that I'm going to tell you about happened, we think, in 1951. Scott was sent on a patrol with 20 men. He was in charge of the patrol. They came to the airstrip. They went away from the airstrip, and they were hiding themselves amongst the trees and bushes and grasses, camouflaging, to check out any enemy movement. They came upon a village. They hunkered down and watched the village to see if there was any enemy there. They didn't see any. Right at that point, as they were hunkered down, Scott being at the front, the men in the back, this sergeant made his way up, came up to Scott and tapped him on the shoulder. And he said, "We've cleared for enemy." "Yes." Suddenly, this girl had come out of a hut, a very beautiful Korean girl. He pointed to her and he said to Scott, "I'll be back. I'm going in for R&R." What this meant, and it's something we don't talk about in wartime a lot, but he had allowed his hatred for the enemy to give himself permission to be abusive. He was going to go in and abuse this person. Scott, sensing what he was going to do, he knew what he was going to do. He didn't flinch. He unholstered his service revolver, put it to the guy's temple and said, "You take one step and I am going to blow your brains out." And the sergeant looked over at Scott and he saw the seriousness in his eyes, and he started to shake, and very gingerly he began to back up and go into position. At this point, Scott decided they'd had enough. There were some unknown quantities in his patrol, so he got them together and he got them back to the airstrip. Now, a little while later, the man who had been in the plane going over the same area and having seen some interesting activity, he landed and he looked for Scott after he was debriefed. And he went to Scott and said, "I noticed that we could see you on the ground. You cut off your patrol early. What did you see? What happened?" And Scott told him the whole entire story. The pilot listened in silence. And then he looked at Scott and said, "What we could see from the air is that hillside that was above that village where you were. In it was embedded 150 to 200 North Korean soldiers. They were watching for American activity. If you had gone into that village and done anything, they would have come down off of the hill and would have butchered you to a man. So you didn't just save that girl, you saved your entire troop there, your patrol." The way we know that this happened was that pilot later back at Honshu Air Force Base saw Jesma and told her what had happened. I'm telling you because it shows the character of the man, but he never spoke about it and he did not put it in his memoirs. He held it in his heart. So after 2 years in Korea, Jesma and Scott were stationed in New Jersey for a year so he could recertify as a pilot, something you had to do. Then he was sent to the University of Illinois, where he finally got his Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. While he was there, they had 2 children, Ross and Keith. And then, once he got the degree, they sent him to Los Alamos. The family went to Albuquerque, and he went to Los Alamos and became part of the Atomic Commission. We don't know a lot of what was done there specifically because it is still highly classified, but he was part of the research and testing for the new thermonuclear warheads that they were developing in that area. The one anecdote I would like to share is of a more personal nature, is that while they were there, his youngest son, Keith, became quite ill at the age of 16 months. He became so sick that for 5 days he held a temperature of 105 degrees. It was so bad Scott had to leave work and go and hold vigil at the cot in the hospital. The doctor came in and told the grief-stricken parents that baby Keith was probably not going to make it because a little body like that just can't suffer that long at that high of a fever. And when the doctor went out, Jesma later said that Scott was so upset he took the end of the bed And he picked it up off the ground and he was like, no, 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 no. And then suddenly he stopped. His whole body relaxed. He set the bed down. Then he turned to Jessma and he said, he's going to be all right, my guardian angel told me. And within 30 minutes, the baby's temperature broke. And over the next several days, he began to get better and stronger. Throughout life, he was not without issue because of that, but he did live, miraculously, according to the doctors. One other funny aside, though, with work, the only thing that Scott would ever say is that one time he went into a top secret meeting with people he wouldn't name. They went into a went into a room, closed the door, turned off the lights, and watched a military film. And then they discussed what they'd seen on the film as it was flipping around in the projector and the lights still off. When they turned on the light, the door had never opened, and now there were only 9. And to the end of his life, people would say, well, where did the 10th one go? He was like, top secret stuff, don't know. So, anyway, in 1959, he left Los Alamos, and they wanted to station him somewhere else, but he now had a degree. He had a degree. He thought he could make so much more money for his growing family. So what he did was, he went to his superior officer and said, I think I'm gonna call it a day. I'm gonna turn in my official resignation tomorrow and start that process, but I know I can make a lot more money for my family if I go into the private sector. And his superior officer was like, Scott, stop. You're so good at what you do. We need men like you. What would it take? Okay, what would it take? So Scott came up with the most outlandish thing he could think of. The only way that I'll stay in the military is if you send me to Stanford in California so that I can get my master's in mechanical industrial engineering. All right, see you tomorrow. I'll give you my papers. He went home, they packed. Jessma typed up his resignation. He signed it. The next day he went into his officer and said, here it is. And his superior officer picked up the envelope on his desk and said, here it is. Be careful what you ask for. So off they went to Stanford, where he completed his master's. He completed it just in time for the Cuban Missile Crisis. There he was sent from California to Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. There with the very famous General Goldsworthy, they were tasked with taking the ICBM missiles that were just standing out in the ground pointing towards the sky and putting them in silos for protection. By the time the Cuban Missile Crisis got to a very frightening pinnacle, those missiles were in the ground, but they weren't what they call at the ready. That means that they were going to have to race to get them to the point where you could push a button and they could go. So during this period of time, where the world, and especially America, was holding its breath, wondering if we were going to go into a nuclear war, they worked round the clock to make sure that if we did, we would at least be somewhat protected. Fortunately, as you know, cooler heads prevailed, diplomacy prevailed, and the Russians backed down and took their missiles out of Cuba. And for that, Scott and General Goldsworthy won the Legion of Merit Award, which is the highest medal you can receive in the military that's non-combat. And from that, they sent him to California, and then they sent him to Alabama because they were preparing Scott to go to Vietnam. So he was a little bit in Alabama learning how to fly a C-47, which was a transport plane. They were making him head of all logistics in Vietnam. That means that all the supplies that would come in to support all the troops, that was a program that he was to create, organize, and improve. That was what he was supposed to do. So, with the family in Montgomery and his wife expecting a caboose baby that they did not expect, Scott went off to Vietnam, and when they first toured him in the base at Phung Thao, it's Bung Tao, I always say Phung Tao, it's Bung Tao, they showed him the enlisted men's quarters, the men who would be under him. And of course, it was clean and neat. It was, military standard with the cot and everything that they were supposed to have, except one thing. They were in an incredibly tropical climate, extremely hot, so oppressively hot, and no air conditioning. Then they showed Scott where he would be residing in the officers' quarters. He went in, he, approved of the room, and then he saw in the window an air conditioning unit. He turned to the officer next to him and he said, "Do the enlisted men have air conditioning?" And the man said, "Well, no, you just saw. No, of course not." And he said, "Tear it out. Tear it out. If they're going to risk their lives and they don't have air conditioning, I don't want air conditioning." And so they tore it out. The next thing that I'm going to tell you about, because there's so many stories, but I'm going to just choose my favorites, is there was one day so this was 67 to 69, this was in 68. He was in a C-47, a transport plane, important for you to know because it had no guns. It was not armed. You could not protect yourself. So largely, they would come in, drop off supplies, and then go. As he was coming into an airfield where he was supposed to drop supplies, there was a huge battle going on. There was 1,000 North Vietnamese fighting what they figured was about 100 American servicemen. And it was way outnumbered. The American servicemen were fighting expertly when they were trying to fall back to the airstrip, hoping that help would come. When Scott saw this, he got on the radio and he said, "When is help getting down here? This is what is happening. How soon before you can come rescue these men?" And the pilots told him, "It'll take us 15, maybe 20 minutes and we'll be there." He said, "Too late, they're gonna die." So what he did is he put the phone down and he went in. He went into the airstrip, no guns. He went in, and as he began to land, he began to be hit hit by the enemy, just rifled the side of his plane. But he went in, he came in for a landing, and then he turned the plane so the side without the door was faced toward the Viet Cong. And as they began to rifle the side of the plane, he opened the doors, and from the forest that he was facing, the Americans, the 100 Americans, came running in. Then they closed the door, and then he turned, and that side took all the fire. And he was just barely able to make it up off the tarmac and just barely back to base. He saved 100 men without any type of having a weapon. And for that, he got the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of a number that he got. But again, it shows the character of the man. He went in without questioning, without double thinking it, and knowing he could die. He just went in and he did it. When he finished his stint in Vietnam, he had a few years in the Pentagon where he was put in charge of all logistics for the Air Force throughout the world. That was supposed to end with him being put in a diplomatic post that would result in him finally making Brigadier General. But right before he was to go on that post, our current president at the time, Richard M. Nixon, abolished the post for other reasons, and Scott was for the 10th time passed over for general by someone who didn't have either the war experience, the number of citations he had, or even the education. And that's when he realized he needed to get out. It was time. It was 30 years. At this point, it was 1972, and he needed to think about being able to provide for their future. So at this point, he really resigned from the military. He was immediately picked up by Rockwell International. They brought him to California, and there he and Justma had the money finally to buy themselves a beautiful, decent home. It was up in the Encino Hills, looking out over the valley. He worked there 10 years, and he was in charge of the MX missile, designing the MX missile system and the engines for the space shuttle. He ended up writing the safety manual about safety testing of the metallurgy of the space shuttle engine and the MX missile system. So that's what he did for 10 years. And he was also a hands-on father to his fourth child, his very young daughter, Pamela. And at the end of the 10 years, in 1982, he finally decided, that's it, I'm done, I've done everything I can, and he retired. And when he did that, they had a party for him. And at the end of that day, just when he came back home to the home in Encino, and they walked out onto the deck and they looked out over the valley, and Scott said, turned to Jasmine, he said, not bad for a poor boy from Mississippi. He was right. For the next 20 years, or the last 20 years of his life, he devoted himself to raising Pamela, being a wonderful father to grown children, and when divorces happened, he provided incredible emotional support to the grandchildren who were kind of the collateral damage of those situations. He also was involved in charity work. He was very active in the Presbyterian Church in Encino. He did a ton of family history work that took him miles away, lots of money, lots of time. But he finally was able to compile 300 years worth of history of the Gibson family. In 1994, there was a big earthquake in Los Angeles, and it took their Encino home and set it off the foundation. For the next 9 months while that was being repaired, he and his wife rented an apartment in Marina del Rey, and they finally sat down and wrote detailed accounts of their memoirs of their life. And that's why we have so much information about them today. And then, of course, Scott took care of his wonderful mother, Martha, who never left California once she got there. And what I didn't tell you is that she had become a flapper after the divorce for the rest of her life, completely at odds with the serious nature of her son. But they loved each other unconditionally. To Scott, she was just mother. To Martha, he was little winky, because when he was a baby, his little eyes winked when you looked at him. And so, whenever she met people, everybody would call him Colonel or Scott, and she just called him Winky. And he never tried to correct her, or change her, or judge her. In 1996, when she died, he was on his knees by her bed, weeping, saying, "Did I do enough for you, Mother? Did I take care of you enough, my mother?" He loved her so much. Her ashes were scattered in Santa Monica overlooking the beach, and there's actually a memorial bench somewhere around there for her. So, anyway, in the year 2000, in memoriam of his crew from World War II, he flew out to Salt Lake, and he visited family, and he took the wonderful history of the Gibson family, and he had heard that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had this repository for people's family histories and genealogies, because they thought that it was so important, such a sacred thing, that they even, he heard, had an underground place where they stored and protected everything. So he decided he was going to fly out here and walk his family history into that department. And so he did, and they treated it, when they put it, he put it in their hands like it was ancient papyrus that could disintegrate in their hands if they weren't very gentle with it. And they commended him on his work, and it meant the world to him. And then he went back to California. 2 years later, the family gathered at the home and had a Thanksgiving together. And then as everyone was piling out and some were putting luggage into the cars, Scott was helping as usual. One family member noticed that Scott was breathing kind of heavy and rugged and kind of gasping for air. And as they drove away in the car, they thought, that's not normal. And it wasn't. Within a couple of months, he was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis, likely brought on by breathing in the fiberglass and asbestos that covered the B-17 engines that he cleaned after every mission, and the particulate matter that he breathed in at Rockwell International. It took him down very quickly. And in June 19th, 2003, Jesma made the call to all the family. If you want to see him, you better come now. And everyone came from far and near. Children, grandchildren, siblings came. And they went around his bed and they stayed with him for several days, and he actually was able to talk and visit with absolutely everyone. After a couple of days, many had to return to work, but the 4 children, Mark, Ross, Keith, and Pamela, stayed bedside. On the night of June 25th, 2003, the 4 children were around his bed. Scott gave his last command. Looking at his children, he said, "Take care of your mother." And they promised that they would. Then 3 of the children left and went home to go to bed. But the oldest, Mark, pulled up the extra bed that was in that room next to his father and lay next to him, listening to him breathe throughout the night. And then at a point when the breathing grew really ragged and he was struggling so much just to get some air, Mark turned the air up as high as he could, and then he made it clear he wanted more morphine for his father so that he could not perceive that he was suffocating. Right before the morphine was turned up and he lost consciousness, Scott was looking at the end of the room, and he said his last word. Angel. Colonel Winfield Scott Gibson III, hero of 3 wars, force of nature, dedicated father, son, brother, grandfather, was carried safely home at last.
Wow. Don't you wish that all of our family stories would be developed and you put it all together and you somehow put it in an hour? I mean, that's really amazing. There's a lot of moments in there too. Let's have another round of applause to Elizabeth Gibson. Oh, yes. And if you were watching, whether here or watching through the stream, you'll notice that there's this picture here, and this would actually be him. Mm-hmm. So did you want to say a couple things about the picture quick?
Sure. These are Vietnam era of Scott. We have a lot more, but these are our favorites. And he had so many medals that he had to choose on his his dress uniform, which ones he would put on because he couldn't use them all. So, but there he was. Yeah.
And which of his sons?
I'm married to Mark.
Oh. But yeah, you can probably notice, and maybe you already figured it out when you look that way, but I'm so glad that you shared that and you brought that here. I mean, just so wonderful to do that. Breathe. That's just so wonderful. Just so wonderful. All right, so here's what happens next. We actually get to have some treats, which is fun. Now, those who are streaming, I'm sorry, you can't have them through the screen. However, you have full permission to go into your own fridge and treat yourself. So, get something good, something that you don't usually grab. That'd be great. And that way we get our treat, you get your treat, and it's good, right? Awesome. And make sure in the chat, you throw in some of those comments, because I bet Elizabeth is going to look at it later, and she's going to see who's there. And if you want to make sure she knows that you are here, then you better put some emojis and things in there. All right. Just want to make sure. Now, just a reminder again, people can come whether or not they donate, though we can go to storycrossroads.org/donate, and that way, whether you're streaming or you're here, that's always appreciated, and every little bit makes a difference. And also, the next one is going to be on April 11th, and April 11th is going to be in Orem. It's going to be hosted by the Jessup family, and that's going to actually be Randall McGee performing as Hans Christian Andersen, and he's actually doing the paper cutting stories. Yes, so if you're familiar with that, Hans Christian Andersen did that all the time, and so Randall McGee also has that skill, and he's actually had many exhibits because of that art, and he's had commissioned work and everything. So that's going to be really exciting. I'm going to flash that on the screen for the streamers so you can see that. And then we're getting really close. We have our 10th, I can't believe it, our 10th annual Story Crossroads Summit and Festival. So that one is May 5th through 8th this year. And it's mostly in the Murray area, either the Murray Park Church of Christ or the Murray City Park itself. So it depends on what day. And there's a lot of things that are virtual too. So if you go to storycrossroads.org/festival, then you'll check it out, and I'll flash that on there as well. So without further ado, let's make sure people can get the treats, and make sure you can mingle and chat, and of course thank Elizabeth for this evening. All right, thanks so much, everybody. Because there's some very yummy berries and things up here.
I did them all by myself.
Oh, she did that all by herself.
These, I have no idea. They're limited screen edition.
Yeah. They look too good. We just got them. We don't even know what they are. They taste like.
Yeah,
They just look too good.
If they look good, we take them. If they taste bad, we still take them. That's my family motto. Somehow it's a motto.
My son-in-law